This is the Colorado Field Ornithologists Zoom meeting about shorebirds this evening. We're really glad you signed on. I have a couple things to just remind you about. If you look at the bottom of your screen in the very center, it says chat. This evening, if you have any questions for Eric, if you would put those in the chat box down below, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the meeting. Also, make sure that you have muted yourself, which is in the bottom left-hand corner. And also in the bottom left-hand corner is your video. Go ahead and turn off your video. That includes you, Larry Griffin. Thanks, Larry. Great. I want to thank everybody that filled out a survey for CFO. We did that in the month of July. We're tabulating those results right now, and that will help guide us in the future for our organization. So I want to thank all those participants that did fill out a survey. It's past due right now, so you can't help us out anymore, but we appreciate it. All right, the last thing I want to bring up before we bring on our fantastic guest is we're offering Shorebird field trips. Dun, da, da. And they're going to be the last week in August and the first 2 weekends in September. For members, you got notification a couple weeks ago and you've been actively signing up. It's $10 a field trip. And if you're a non-member, we'd love to have you join as a member. It's $25 to join for the field trip. But if you sign up as a member, then after that, the field trips are only $10. If you're interested in signing up, and our guest tonight, Eric Hynes, is actually leading a couple of field trips that there's still space available. I can't believe it, but go to Cobirds, COBIRDS.org. Go to the Fall Shorebird Workshop, the pink box on the right-hand side, and start signing up for some fantastic field trips. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Hynes. His interest in birds started with a common loon in Maine years ago. He has birded across the United States and Central America. He currently lives in Telluride, Colorado. He's a guide for the prestigious tour company called Field Guides, and he has his very own tour company called Box Canyon Birding. So with all that, I'd like to introduce Eric Hynes, fantastic instructor, bird expert. Eric, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sue. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up tonight on this Zoom workshop. I hope everyone is fully vaccinated and happy and healthy where they are. And I'm delighted to share my interest in shorebirds with all of you. And this here in Colorado in particular. So looking forward to this evening. This is a beautiful black-necked stilt here on the cover, if you will, with that really long pink legs and long skinny bill and dramatic black and white plumage. And I subtitled this Forget the Feathers because it's really easy to look at plumage and get caught up in that. And oftentimes with shorebirds, the plumage can be helpful or it can be deceiving. And so I'm going to give you some clues that'll help you not rely on the feathers so much as we go through these slides tonight. As Sue mentioned, my name is Eric Hynes. I live here in smoky Telluride. This is from earlier today. Unfortunately, these wildfires in the West, California and Oregon and Washington, Montana and such are bringing in some really dramatic smoke here in Telluride in the Valley. But I work for Field Guides internationally, leading some tours. I'm headed to Maine in September and some other places going down the road. And then locally here in Colorado, I have my own company called Box Canyon Birding. So that's, I'm not quite in the picture, but this is smoky Colorado here. All right, well, when the Field Trips Committee asked me to lead a workshop on shorebird identification, I went to eBird and found 42 species of shorebirds in Colorado. So kudos to all of you for getting out there and finding all of these shorebirds. But I thought, geez, we'd be up till midnight if I tried to go through identifying all of these. So I was thinking about how do I pare this impressive list of birds down, which is particularly impressive given the fact that we don't have a coast. So it's impressive indeed. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to give some clues about the species that could be the next new bird for Colorado? Here on the left, we have if you look carefully there, you'll see a bristle-thighed curlew from Alaska. And over on the right there, that is a black-tailed godwit from Iceland. So neither one of them are on the shorebird list for Colorado yet, so keep your eyes out. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. So instead, that's not really realistic or helpful to all of you looking for shorebirds right now. So what I did is I went back through the list and I said, well, what's really obvious? Things like the black-necked stilt and American avocet, a pretty basic understanding of bird identification, and you can figure those out. And some of them, like the ruff or the purple sandpiper or the red knot, those are birds that rarely come through Colorado. So I kind of painted out. So we're going to pick these 20 more conspicuous migrants here in the state, and we'll go through them for identification tips. All right, as I was saying, forget the feathers. What's better to lean on is these on the list here on the left. Structure is really, really critical because birds' feathers change with age, with wear, with maturity, with season. So you've got breeding and non-breeding, you've got adults, you've got immatures, you've got fresh plumage, you've got warm plumage. So feathers can help, but they can also be quite deceiving. So structure, no matter what shape the feathers are in, structure stays the same. So looking at the body shape, the leg length, the neck length, the head shape, the bill in particular is a very good spot too as well. So structure is a really key thing. That doesn't change throughout the year, does not change with gender, does not change with feather wear or anything else. So we're going to focus on structure as we think about these shorebirds, and also behavior. Shorebirds are really dynamic. They will forage in a variety of different ways. And oftentimes that foraging behavior is dictated by the habitat that they prefer. So habitat is tied into it. And vocalizations, I mean, we think about Pidnax flycatchers or warblers or thrushes, and we think about leaning on the songs and the calls of songbirds in particular for identification. But I think what's undervalued among the birding community is how diagnostic vocalizations can be. So we'll talk about that as well as we're going through these species. As mentioned, the habitat that they like to use. And then also just right here from the start, I think it's really important to point out that it's okay to be unidentified. That's just the nature of birding. Nobody, I tell my kids, nobody's perfect, but practice gets you closer. And that's just what birding is all about too. We get out there in the field, but sometimes the conditions are really challenging. It could be lighting, it could be wind, it could be rain, it could be distance, could be heat shimmer. Sometimes you just can't say with certainty. So trust that unidentified column in that eBird checklist. The nice part is these aren't flitting little warblers or kinglets or something. These are birds that stick to certain habitats, and if you don't get too close to them, they often won't flush, they'll move around. But have some patience when you're looking at shorebirds. Take time to study them. They become quite dynamic as you watch them. So oftentimes your first impression may not be the correct one. It takes some time. So just take your time and accept the fact that not everyone gets to be identified. Also, I'll talk a bit about molt. There are some clues for some species, the timing of the molt, and just timing in general. When are we seeing these birds? Are these early fall migrants? Are they late fall migrants? So think about these items, those different points as we work our way through. Of course, here, the species that I did not highlight, that ones that were not in bold. Sorry, go back here. The ones that are kind of fainted out, if you will, I will try and highlight some of those during the introduction slides, just so you see them at least once, but I won't, drill down too specifically about some of these. But here we have a beautiful American avocet, a large shorebird, very long-legged, those pale gray legs, a long, very thin needle-like bill. And this is a good example of a species where there is sexual dimorphism in terms of the size and shape of the bill. For American avocets, the males have this flatter, only slightly recurved bill. Females having more dramatic recurve on the bill. All right. So really what we want to look at is, as we go through structure, and in particular, as I talk about structure, talk about gist, the general impression of size and shape. So here on the left, we have a marbled godwit, just an absolutely gorgeous shorebird, one of the largest in North America. Godwits with very long bills, slightly recurved. And what I mean by that is the bill slightly tips upward. It's not perfectly flat, and it's not drooping. It's not decurved. It is recurved. But really long bill compared to the size of the head, much longer than the head is wide, very long-legged, a large shorebird, and fairly slim, that long skinny neck. On the right, Wilson snipe, a bird that is common in many parts of Colorado. They have that wonderful breeding display. But look at the structural difference between these two species. The Wilson snipe being very plump, round-bodied, short-necked. You can see the substrate it's standing in. There's water, obviously, but just a little bit of water. This is a fairly short-legged shorebird compared to the really long legs of the marbled godwit. You can't see the bill on this Wilson snipe, but you can certainly see that it's very plump-bodied, short-necked. So study the structure of these birds as we go along. And all the photos in the presentation tonight are from myself. I took all of them except the exceptions I've labeled so that you know who the photographer is, but if it's not labeled, then you can assume it's my photo. As I mentioned earlier, patience really pays off when you're studying shorebirds. If they're actively foraging or they're roosting, they might look very different. This is the same individual short-billed Dowitcher. This is a juvenile. But if you look, the neck on the left essentially is absent. And then in a more alert and nervous posture on the right, the neck is all of a sudden telescoping up. And my daughter got a kick out of, she didn't really believe this is the same bird. So take advantage. So that's what I mean by patience. Take your time with shorebirds. You get to a mud flat somewhere, a reservoir that's drying up. Really take your time in studying these birds because it's not necessarily going to be obvious right away. All right, here's another example of posture difference. Here's the same species, two different individuals, different times of year. But example, again, of in a little deeper substrate on the left, more water. It looks really short-legged. On the right, on a little firmer substrate. So you can see the feet are right there on the surface. So it looks almost like a much longer-legged peep or small sandpiper. This bird is leaning forward on the right, trying to catch all these millions of little flies on the mud flats. The bird on the left, you can see, is a different posture, shorter neck looking. So same species. So that's a good example of why take your time when you're assessing the shape, the structure of a bird, because their behavior might change that dramatically. All right, thinking about structure, the bill is really, really important. If you're going to look at one part of the bird, go ahead and start with the bill. And oftentimes that's enough to tease it apart. On the left here, we have a long-billed curlew, an appropriately named bird. That incredible bill is decurved, meaning it curves downward or droops towards the tip. They've evolved this wonderful bill to probe deep into substrate, looking for earthworms, crabs, and such on their wintering grounds on the coast, and on their breeding grounds on the grasslands of the West, the Great Plains. They also use that to probe into the grasses, looking for things like, grasshoppers and crickets and beetles and such, but really long bill for probing. Compared to the right here is a flock of ruddy turnstones, a bird we don't really expect to see here in Colorado much. They're a rare bird, but we might see one. You might see one, but look at the bill. It's very short. It's not even quite as long as the head is wide. It's stout at the base and tapers almost like a dagger to a sharp point. And they use that bill to flip over pebbles and shells and stones and such to be able to find their food. So bill is a really good place to look when you're trying to figure out what kind of shorebird it is. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, resource partitioning. Birds have evolved where there is sexual dimorphism in terms of the bill length and shape. for some shorebird species. And so that can kind of muddy the waters, if you will, when you're trying to decide between several different species. Here on the left, this is a pair of long-billed dowitchers. And in general, the female shorebirds have longer bills, average longer bills than males. They just have more dramatic, or in the case on the right for the American avocets, they tend to have a more recurved bill. So on the left here, you can see this is likely the male in front. If you look at the length of this bill behind this bird, its mate, it's a really long bill on a long-billed dowitcher. So this is likely a male long-billed dowitcher, likely a female long-billed dowitcher. And oftentimes, dowitchers are one of the most challenging groups of shorebirds to separate. But when you see a female long-billed dowitcher, you often are like, wow, that's a really long bill on that dowitcher. When you have a male, that's where you tend to have a little bit more of a challenge in trying to decipher, because that could easily, that bird by itself here on the left could easily confuse you for sure. So don't rely on the bill length, but just recognize that females have longer bills than males. In the case of American avocet, here's a female with a more pronounced recurve or upward angle to her bill. And here are two males with a little bit flatter, just slightly recurved bills. The idea behind this, the thought is these species have evolved so they're not in competition with each other. So if you have a pair on a territory, one is going after different food sources with a different shaped bill or different depth perhaps in the substrate, on the case of the dowitchers. So. All right, another neat thing about shorebird bills, they look really stiff and hard, and they're not. They're actually very flexible. Here's a pair, not necessarily a mated pair, but just two Wilson's snipe. And check out this bird above. I think it kind of looks like it's chuckling, or it might be yawning. But notice here, the two parts of the bill, this is the mandible. The upper part of the bill is called the maxilla. You often see it in field guides that are referred to as the upper mandible, but like humans, we just have one jaw. That's not really a mandible, but it's more appropriately referred to as, where did my cursor go? This is the mandible, and this is the maxilla. And check out this last portion, the outermost part here. That's referred to as the distal portion of the maxilla. And back towards the head, this is the basal portion of the maxilla, the distal portion. But here, notice this little recurve. This allows them to stick that 6-inch bill deep into mud and open it up like forceps and grab a worm below the surface and pull it back up without having to open its mouth, which I just think is really, really cool. All right, so I told you to forget about the feathers, but we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about the feathers anyway, because sometimes they can be very helpful. And most field guides will describe birds based on their plumage, and so it's good to know exactly what we're talking about when you see these terms in the field guides. The supercilium is just a fancy word for the eyebrow, that area in the lores on the bill, between the bill and the eye is the lores, and then above that sits the supercilium. The presence or absence of a lighter supercilium is a good indication for some species. The saddle of the bird across the back there is referred to as the mantle. As you go down on that back line, you'll get to the innermost flight feathers. As they all overlap, those are the tertials, and they come into play for quite a few species. That's a good place to look. You'll see the tail tucked in there underneath the primaries that project on this marbled godwit. I don't think I mentioned the species yet, did I? This marbled godwit here, those primaries project just slightly. And then you've got three different tracks of coverts. You've got greater coverts, medium coverts, and lesser coverts. And separating the mantle from those coverts is a track of feathers referred to as scapulars. Comes into play with things like Western sandpiper identification versus semi-palmated sandpiper. And the breast and flanks are often places to look if you've got a bird on the ground. If you have a bird in flight, referring to the flight feathers here in the bolder sections, the outer part of the wing are the primaries. The inner part of the wing is the other secondaries. The tail feathers are referred to as retrices. An individual would be a retrix. Paying attention to the leg length, you can see that in flight based on whether or not the feet project beyond the tail. It can be an indication of the tail length, but more likely the leg length. So if you've got feet beyond the tail, it's fairly long-legged shorebird. For something like a Yellowlegs, there's significant leg exposed beyond the tail. And those upper tail coverts and rump area can be distinctive. And some birds show an eye-ring. So those are some of the tracks of feathers you need to pay attention to as you're looking at a bird, a shorebird that is. Let me just pause here. Were there any questions? Sue, I think, is keeping track of the chat. Were there any questions popping up about feather tracks, or should I go on to the species?
I think we're good so far.
Okay. We're about to get into individual species accounts, but one more thing to keep in mind, if we're talking about feathers, we have adult feathers in breeding plumage can often be quite colorful. They may not have a complete molt though, and oftentimes those retained feathers look a little bit older and worn. So here's a familiar species, the killdeer with the 2 breast bands, a type of plover. But if you'll notice these coverts here into the scapulars, these are all quite worn and faded compared to the mantle up here in these scapulars, a different generation of feathers. So if you're seeing multiple generations of feathers, that's typically indicative of an adult bird. Compared to this end of summer fresh juvenile bird, the juvenile plumage, the first set of feathers that they get, they often just look, to me, they look like they're fresh out of the wrapper. It's like you just unpackage them. They're like that brand new toy. They're shiny and crisp and clean looking. And most shorebirds, all of their coverts tend to have some type of pale fringing. On this killdeer, juvenile, this is the rufous in coloration, but some shorebirds show a frosty white tip to all these covert feathers. So uniform, crisp, clean looking, adults typically more worn, multi-generational of feathers. So that's something to keep in mind as you're analyzing birds. All right, so here's 2 more examples. In this case, 2 different species. Here on the left is a greater Yellowlegs. This is a bird I took a picture of last summer here in Colorado. I think it was in July, maybe early August, right about this time. The adults migrate before the juveniles do. So we've got this bird here, and you can see it's showing these older, more worn, brownish coverts through here, and then up into the scapulars and the mantle. You've got some of these breeding plumage feathers, and then some of these are coming in with the adult wintering or non-breeding grayish feathers that they'll have in the wintering ground. So clearly several different generations of feathers here in this bird, again, indicating an adult bird. Compared to this beautiful young willet, this is a juvenile willet. And so related to Yellowlegs, but look at all these nice pale fringings to all these tracks, and they're all uniform. They have these nice pale fringings to all the coverts here. So that kind of fresh, crisp, scalloped appearance of juveniles versus the more mottled or worn plumage. And that's something to keep in mind as you're assessing feathers. All right, and then just like I said, be patient with yourself. So sometimes you get to a place and there's just birds flying all over a big flock, and you'll think, how do I ever tease these apart? Take your time. You know, if you have a spotting scope, that certainly helps, but you don't have to have a spotting scope to enjoy shorebirds. And just have some fun playing Where's Waldo. But look carefully at individuals, compare them to each other. Sometimes the easiest way to tell species apart is to look at its neighbor. And just, bring your big hats, your umbrella if you need it, some sunscreen, and just take your time and enjoy shorebirds. All right, we're gonna get down into the actual identification of individual species here in Colorado. There are plovers, and then there's sort of sandpipers, if you will. I think of plovers as a big ball connected to a small ball. When I see this American golden plover here on the left, I think of, like a cantaloupe with a racquetball stuck to it. And when I look at this semi-palmated plover here on the right, I think of a softball with a golf ball attached to it. So if you've got a little ball attached to a big ball, that's a really good indication you're dealing with a plover. Also, plovers are very visual oriented in their foraging. They have short bills, fairly stout, thick bills, but they have short bills. And so they don't spend a lot of time probing, but they have excellent vision and they look for prey items, whether it's an insect or a worm or a crustacean. And so often they will walk or run and then stop. They'll cock their head to side, and then they'll scamper on, as opposed to rapid probing or darting around. So plovers, think of a ball attached to little ball attached to a big ball for body structure. And then as individuals, we'll separate the species with other details, but also the foraging behavior. Behaviors are a really good indicator. So American golden plover, this is a beautiful adult in breeding plumage. Here we have immature or juvenile semi-palmated plover. And so I'm going to separate the small plovers. We have two big ones. We have the American golden plover and the black belly coming through. And then we have three small ones to deal with. And the three small ones, the semi-palmated, like here on the right, is the only one that's really chocolatey. So if you've got a small plover, rounded head, rounded body, walking around, looking, scanning, probing occasionally, and it's brown, it's going to be a semi-palmated plover. It's a fairly straightforward ID. What gets a little trickier are the two pale-backed small plovers that we see on open landscapes here in Colorado. Neither one of which are common. They're both uncommon breeders we have, but some of them passing through as well. On the left here, we have piping plover. On the right is snowy plover. And where you really want to look, so they're both small, round-bodied, round-headed, walking, stalking, looking for prey. The difference is at either end. The piping plover has a stouter bill. It's thicker at the base and tapers. And the snowy plover, no matter what age or time of year, has a thinner, more needle-like bill. In breeding plumage, the piping plover has a nice orangey golden base or basal portion to the bill with a distal dark tip. On the snowy plover, it's always all dark. So if you're getting any color at the base of the bill, you're thinking piping plover. And then look at the leg color difference. On a piping plover, in breeding season, particularly when the hormones are raging, the piping plover gets a nice orangey golden legs. And then the snowy plover has nice dark legs and breeding plumage. As juveniles and in the winter, that gets to be more gray, and the piping plover, they lose this nice orange and they can be quite dull, and juveniles can be quite grayish as well. So the leg color is not as helpful outside of the breeding season, but the bill structure, like I said, think structure, the bill structure never changes. The amount of white on the forehead versus, how big the black patches in the crown or how extensive the breast band is, that is not a reliable field mark. It's variable by individual, variable by gender, variable by time of year. So, but if you're looking at a small plover, check out that bill structure. All right, we've got two large plovers to deal with. Here we just have one individual species. This is black-bellied plover. And in breeding plumage, it's quite distinctive, but that's not really what we're doing tonight. We're trying to tease them out when they're difficult. But again, think little ball on a big ball, round-headed. And as plovers go, black-bellied has a pretty stout, thick bill. You can see that again here in this bird in flight. And what's distinctive about this bird is the axillaries, this wing pit, if you will. These are black here. On its close cousin, the American golden plover, they lack that dark patch. So if you see them in flight, look into the wing pits, the axillaries in here, and then the bill structure. And then compare that to its close cousin, the American golden plover. And they're stunning. They're gorgeous birds, but again, round body, round headed. To me, they look like sort of have a dove-like head. It's a little smaller headed, more petite. It's certainly a smaller bill. Oftentimes they have a capped appearance where the crown is cleanly separated from a light supercilium. And then structurally, really elongated. They have very long wings compared to the black-bellied plover. And so here is a comparison shot of the two species together. Black-bellied's a little bit larger headed, heavier build, colder, grayer overall. These are young birds in fall migration. And the American golden plover has more of this kind of cute, petite, dove-like head, the capped appearance, a proportionally smaller bill, and then really attenuated, really long-winged, a lot of bird beyond the body. So those are the big plovers and the little plovers, which are pretty straightforward. You're going to find them in big like sod farms, open fields, landscapes of that nature. I might as well start in on the vocalizations too. If you're not sure, of course, in a picture like this, when you have them side by side, it's not terribly difficult to separate them. But when you have them alone, you don't have that comparison. So I'm going to play for you now. This is the call notes of the black-bellied plover. So if a clear plaintive call, and compare that to the American golden plover. It's a little sharper, higher, thinner. And I think to me, just both of them have a mournful quality to them, but the American golden plover is just a little higher, thinner, shriller sounding. And that's a really good indication of separating these two. All right, so we've taken care of the plovers. So we're going to jump into the sandpipers, and we'll start small and we'll get bigger as we go. So the smallest shorebird of all, the least sandpiper. Structure first. I always think about structure first and head right to that bill. If you notice in all three of these individuals, the bill of a least sandpiper is fairly broad at the base, and then it tapers to a fairly significant point, and there's an ever so subtle droop to the bill. So it's a slightly decurved or drooping bill, and it tapers from the basal portion to the distal portion to a finer tip. So that's a good indication. I also like to think of least light when it comes to leg color. Of the small sandpipers we'll see in the field, least sandpipers have light colored legs. It's sort of a greenish, dull yellow leg. So yellow legs on least sandpipers, and they're not bright yellow, they're kind of dull. And a word of caution, these are sandpipers. They walk in mud. Mud gets on their legs if they're in deep mud, gets caked on, and the legs become brown, gray, or black even in appearance. So that is a field mark that is reliable. None of the other small sandpipers that you would have to worry about in terms of confusing them with Western or semi-palmated have light colored legs. But if a least sandpiper's legs are covered up with mud, you've lost that option. So look at the bill structure. Stay at the base, tapering to a point with a slight droop. And in general, if you've got a flock of shorebirds, when I see least sandpipers, I often think of them as the warmest of the bunch. If I have least among a flock of Westerns or semi-palmateds, Westerns and semi-palmateds look colder and grayer to me. These least sandpipers have a more of a brownish, warmer cast. On the left are two individuals in the spring migration, so they're nice and bright and fresh. The one on the right is a bird on its wintering grounds, so it's as cold and as gray as they get, but it still has sort of a warm tone to it. So I'm looking for a small, I'm looking for light colored legs, I'm checking out that bill. And least sandpipers love to eat. And what I mean by that is, that's what I think of when I hear a least sandpiper calling. And they call frequently, and when they're in flight or moving around, they'll get vocalizing. And to me, it sounds like they're saying, eat, eat, eat. So if you've got a flock of least sandpipers coming in, sandpipers that are flying at you and they're settling down onto a mud flat, and they're saying eat, 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 that's a good indication you've got least sandpipers. And they're also not afraid to get up into the grasses a little bit. So if you get to a wetland area, you've got a big reservoir or marsh, And a big reservoir here in Colorado is a likely place to find them. You'll find some shorebirds out in the water. Some of them are at the water's edge, but these sandpipers aren't afraid to get tucked into the grasses a little bit. So you can easily overlook them because of their small size, but also their propensity for going into sort of the more vegetated areas of a wetland. All right, ever so slightly larger in size is the great deceiver. My friend Kathy Mim Dunning shared this photo on the left. We have two sandpipers that are really tricky to tease apart. They are smaller peeps. They're like the least sandpiper, ever so slightly larger than least. They both have dark legs. You can't really get fooled by dark legs in terms of they're never going to have light legs. If you see light legs, you've got a least. But if you've got dark legs, you're looking at these two. And so again, think about structure, think about the bill. For Western sandpipers, they have a longer bill that is drooping. And then the semi-palmated sandpiper on the right, this bird has on average a shorter bill, and it's blunt tipped and it stays straight. In proportion to its head width, this Western sandpiper has a longer bill. There's more tapering from the base to the tip, and there's a slight decurve or droop to the bill. And keep in mind, females have longer bills than males. So a particularly short-billed semi-palmated sandpiper is likely a male. Or so if you see a peep, it's got dark legs, overall kind of a colder, grayer appearance, then I'm thinking it's a semi-palmated. If you've got one that's particularly long billed, that gets me leaning towards Western, and then also look for that droop. This bird on the left is in fall migration. It's adult coming down from the breeding ground, so it's retained some breeding plumage. You can see some of these feathers are nice and clean and new. This is winter or basic plumage here, non-breeding. These feather tracks here, this gray scapulars, but this rust through here, and these coverts and scapulars that are still retained dark centers, and this nice rust to the crown is indicative of Western sandpiper. Also, the proportions of these two species. I think of semi-palmated sandpiper as fairly balanced over its legs, kind of evenly spaced body. Western sandpipers tend to look chesty. They tend to look front forward, if you will, like there's more bird, like they're unbalanced. There's more bird in front of its legs than the back. I'm mentioning all these field marks, and throughout this process, please keep in mind these are all take some evaluation. We all have our opinions about these things, and so it's not a whole lot of characteristics that are cut and dry and definitive. So you have to take the balance of all the field marks you can gather. So that's what I mean by being patient. Absorb as much as you can to really get a sense of it all. All right, so Western versus St. Palmated. Look at the bill structure and the overall body proportions. Here's another slide just to follow up on those more likely. Semi-palmated certainly come through in numbers at times in parts of Colorado, but Western is a little more common. But again, these Westerns kind of front forward, like there's more, a lot of bird in front of the legs. It doesn't look balanced. A long bill that is decurved or drooping. And then they have these oftentimes nice rusty scapulars, this feather track back through here. But again, kind of big-headed, chest heavy, forward-leaning body, and that longer bill with a droop. All right, stepping up to the next group, the other two peeps, if you will, small sandpipers that we have passing through Colorado. We have two very similar ones. They're similar in that they have a long winged appearance, primary protection or wing extension beyond the tail. Oftentimes, you'll have in field guides, these two species talk about the wing length in comparison to the tail. And I find that challenging to see because oftentimes the primaries extend and overlap and you can't really evaluate where the tail is on these. And these are examples. So what you can evaluate though, this part of the wing, these are the tertials here, these feathers right here, and these feathers right here are tertials. And look at the primary extension beyond the tertials. Again, tertials here, and then primary extension beyond that. And here on the left, tertials, and then primary extension beyond the tertials. If we go back to look at these western sandpipers, look at the tertials here, and then just a little bit of primary going on. Tertials with just a little bit of primary going on. Here again, these are well-worn tertials, but they come up to the length of the primaries. Here in the semi-palmated sandpiper on the right, these tertials come right to the tail tip, the primary tip, sorry. So when you are trying to evaluate a bird and look overall at its structure, its shape, think of the silhouette. These birds, the western on the left, the semi-palmated on the right. Here are 3 westerns. And now look at these bared sandpipers on the right and a white-rumped sandpiper on the left. And look at how much of the primary. So I like to look at primary extension beyond tertials more than trying to evaluate it. And overall, this bird just has there's a lot of bird extending out beyond the legs. Same for these bairds here, a lot of bird extending beyond. So long-winged, which is indication of a long-distance migrant. So how do you separate them? Well, this is a breeding plumage white rump sandpiper, but no matter what plumage, they typically show a more conspicuous supercilium than the bairds does. Their bill is more tapered. I think of it as a larger version of a least sandpiper, and that the bill is fairly broad at the base, tapers to a nice point, and it's got a droop to the bill. And if you can see it well enough, if you're close enough, if the lighting's appropriate, if you have a good scope, the white rump sandpiper, the basal portion of the mandible is always lighter than the rest of the bill. It's sort of a warm brown in breeding season, then it kind of gets duller, browner, almost grayish in the winter. But the basal portion of the mandible is a different color than the rest of the bill on the white rumps. The baird's bill is long, straight, without a droop, and more evenly proportioned. The width of the bill here versus the tip, and this actually is a bit deceiving. It's a little more pointed. That's a water droplet on the end of the bill, making it look a little more blunt tipped. But it's not nearly as tapered as the white rumped. And overall too, you get more of a kind of western sandpiper look to rusty scapulars on these westerns, on the white rumped sandpiper. And on the baird sandpipers, these are nice, fresh, beautiful, juvenile baird sandpipers. We see them here. I feel like we see more juvenile birds than adults in fall migration. And to me, they have overall a warm, sandy appearance. But then they also have a frosty appearance because they have these beautiful white edgings to all the coverts and the scapulars and the mantle feathers. So it gives them a scalloped look. Really just a gorgeous shorebird. So there are 5 peeps, the least with the light legs and the smallest, the western and the semi-palmated with those not too long-winged, and then the 2 long-winged versions, the bairds and the white rumped. So those are our peeps, if you will. All right, so getting a little better, same family still, but getting a little bit larger in the Chadris, these sandpipers. We have a sanderling. We get to see them, and of course they're pretty distinctive when they're at the coast, behavior-wise, chasing those waves, running in, running out. As we see them here in migration, though, oftentimes we'll see the juvenile plumage. This is a juvenile. Look how fresh and clean it is, but really what pops about the sanderling is it's fairly heavy-bodied, and it's got a stout bill, and it's really contrasting, very clean white. It's often the brightest, whitest shorebird on a mudflat if you've got lots of different shorebirds. They really pop with their white bellies and their contrasting dark backs and that nice scalloping. Here's an adult in full winter non-breeding plumage. It's completed its molt, and overall almost ghostly, clean white below, pale gray in the back, but again, a heavier bodied sandpiper with a stout bill. They don't do a lot of wave chasing here in Colorado, obviously, but if you see them other places, so check the shorelines, watch for them probing and running about. All right, another slightly larger sandpiper, Dunlin. And we don't often get to see this beautiful breeding plumage here. This is a bird I'll admit some of these photos I did not take in Colorado. This is a picture I took up in Alaska, but a really distinctive bird as an adult, the rusty rusty back, the black belly. Really nothing to confuse that with. So it gets confusing as we see them, the juveniles in fall, migrating through. And what I'm looking at here is a big, heavy-bodied sandpiper with a proportionally long bill and a conspicuous D curve. That drooping bill is long. So you might confuse this with a Western sandpiper in the sense that it has a long recurved bill, but this is a heavier, plumper bodied, really stout shorebird. So structurally quite a bit different, more robust. Another heavy-bodied sandpiper on the larger side, we have pectoral sandpipers, and this is another one that likes to vocalize a fair amount. So if you have one coming into land at a site, it's a good one. It's a pretty distinctive call. I'll play it here. In my head, I say chirp, chirp, chirp. There's sort of a throaty quality to that chirp, chirp, chirp. Pectoral sandpipers, look at the breasts, very heavily streaked with an abrupt demarcation to a white belly. Here's an adult in breeding plumage, a juvenile and fresh, gorgeous fall migration, crisp juvenile bird. But both of them heavily streaked breast with a clean demarcation to a white belly, plump body, giving them a sort of a small-headed appearance and a recurved bill. And it's sort of two-tone. It's light, kind of a dull brownish and high breeding plumage, a little bit orange, fall migration, I think, but paler at the base, darker at the tip, or basal portion, distal portion of the bill. And overall nice and crisp, rusty, but look at how plump that body is. A really heavy-bodied sandpiper. All right, one of the more distinctive ones, but still in that kind of small sandpiper category, the spotted sandpiper we have here, and can look very different. They don't always have spots. Here on the left, this is a nice adult I took on the San Miguel River in spring migration. So they are quite spotted and distinctive, and they love to bob their body. They kind of do these little squats, almost like a dipper, but this part of the body goes up and down, up and down, up and down. They really do a lot of bobbing. That's a good field mark for them. In fall, though, this time of year, you'll start to see juveniles, and they lack the spots. But what's distinctive about spotted sandpiper is the light colored legs. Adult and fresh breeding plumage here, it's kind of pinkish. The kids are golden, but they're light colored legs, plump bodied, sort of a heavy chesty bird. They always have this sort of dark patch coming down under the chest. And then look at all these beautiful coverts and scapulars here. All these nice buffy edges to it, so a scalloped appearance of a youngster. And a fairly significant supercilium. They have an eye ring, but they also show a supercilium. And that comes into play when comparing it to another bird that likes to bob, the solitary sandpiper. Okay, so we've taken care of the plovers. Those two balls connected, a big ball and a smaller ball for a head. They like to run around and look for their prey. We've taken care of the small sandpipers. The sandpipers, we've taken care of all those least and western and such. So we're going to jump up into the Tringa shorebirds. These are in the genus Tringa, and we've got the Yellowlegs, excuse me. And I like the summary statement of everything about a greater is greater, okay? As I mentioned, start with the structure. Look at the bills. The best way to do it is compare it to itself. Here on the left is a lesser Yellowlegs. Look at the width of the head in comparison to the length of the bill. And so if you overlaid this bill in front of the head, it's usually pretty much exactly equidistant. So the bill length is close to or precisely the width of the head. On the greater Yellowlegs, the width of the head compared to the length of the bill is about 1.5 times the head width. So you've got another 50% length on the bill of the greater Yellowlegs compared to the least. Also, the least, say, fairly consistently thin, needle-like, and quite pointed. On the greater Yellowlegs, the bill is a little bit more stout not quite as needle-like at the tip, and a little broader at the base. So a little bit heavier bill and longer. And since we're on the head, look at the eyes. Greater yellowlegs, and this takes some practice. It's subtle. It's not always going to be helpful for everyone, but I look at greater yellowlegs and I see a big kind of bold, shocking eye. When I see the eye on a lesser yellowlegs, that eye appears to me to be sort of smaller, giving them more of a kind of a dove-like head, sort of a cute look to them with a small-eyed appearance, where the greater yellowlegs has proportionally a larger eye. So longer bill, larger eye, everything about a greater is greater. It's overall a bigger bird. I chose to size these images so that you weren't, this is not proportionate. This is a bigger bird than this, lesser yellowlegs, but what stays true is the proportion, the length of the bill compared to the width of the bird's head. And that's what is important in this slide. And of course, they're called yellowlegs because they've got these bright yellow legs. They're very long-legged shorebirds. Everything, all species in the Tringa genus has long legs. But here's a good example of be wary of mud on legs. So you might not think this is a yellow leg species because the legs look dark, but this is simply mud. It's stepping into very soft substrate. So a really lanky, long-legged shorebird, thin billed, but lesser is shorter billed, smaller eyed. Okay, everything about a greater is greater. Greater yellowlegs call more often, and they call more notes when they vocalize. So I'm going to pull up, and you can go onto eBird to listen to vocalizations, or if you have an app on your smartphone, any of these will have vocalizations, and they're a good studying point. But greater yellowlegs call, sort of a toot 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 call. It's 3 or more notes, and it's louder. It's really quite robust, and they can really carry on. So really loud, 3 or more notes, and they're more prone to vocalizing compared to the lesser yellowlegs. When it comes to vocalizations, when they call, they typically call only 1 or 2 notes at a time, and it's softer, more subtle, and they're less inclined to call. So here's the call note of the lesser yellowlegs. So that individual recording is 2 noted, but sometimes it's just 1. But I said they're less inclined to call, don't call as often, and they call with less notes. Greater yellowlegs are more inclined to call, are louder and more notes. Everything about a greater is greater. The foraging behavior. Greater yellowlegs are almost spastic in their foraging. If you're watching them foraging in a mud flat, they'll do some running around and they'll abruptly turn around and then sprint back the other direction. Often they're in the shallows of a reservoir and they're chasing small fish or other prey. Lesser yellowlegs are more elegant, more subtle, less jerky in their movements. Again, that's a subjective evaluation. It's not a hard, fast rule. But in general, if I see a very actively foraging yellowlegs, it gets me leaning towards greater. If I see a bird that's a little bit more patient, a little bit slower, more gentle in its movements, I lean towards lesser. Lessers have a smaller migration window. I think of them typically as an early migrant, so July, August migrant. Of course, you can find birds into September and October, but in general, the bulk of their flight comes fairly early in shorebird migration and a more narrow window, a more intense pulse. Greater yellowlegs are coming through already, and they might still be around well into October, and there's probably a few individuals that might even winter in Colorado. So they're really kind of the whole fall possibility. So a more protracted migration window for the greater yellowlegs. So, all right. And so just to see them, to get the sense of the size proportions, here are the 2 different species in the same image. So in the foreground, which makes things look bigger, and yet still this bird clearly is smaller than the one behind it. So, the sort of the fisher person's trick is to hold that fish up with our arms extended out towards the camera to make the fish look bigger. Even with the lesser yellowlegs in front, it's clearly a smaller bird than the greater. So a very useful size comparison if they're together, but an individual size goes out the window. So I'm looking now, start with the bill. The bill length is about equal to the width of the head. On the greater yellowlegs, the bill length is about 1.5 times the width of the head. This is a big eye proportionally to a smaller eye, more of a cute dove-like look to it, and just a more massive bird here.
Eric, we have a couple questions about yellowlegs.
Please.
All right, let's see here. Cliff asks, some greater yellowlegs have recurved bills. Is that an indication of sex?
Yes, so thank you for reminding me of that. I hadn't mentioned that point yet. And their bill difference, yes. Sometimes you will see a recurved bill on a greater yellowlegs, which a lesser yellowlegs never shows. And it probably is a sexual dimorphism. And so I would think, but I do not know if by certainty, that a recurved bill is more likely to be a female, but I don't think that is a hard, fast rule. And that's certainly not something I feel definitive about, but that's a great question and a good reminder to me to mention. A recurve on the yellowlegs makes it a greater, a lesser will never show a recurve. But it's, likely a female, but I don't know that with certainty.
Okay, one more from Diana. Does recurved mean curved up and decurved, curved down?
Yes, indeed. Recurve, it's the tip is higher than the base. Decurved, the tip is lower than the base of the bill. So a drooping bill is decurved and a arching upward bill is recurved.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly, thanks for getting those questions in a timely manner. Okay. All right. In the same genus Tringa as the yellowlegs, this is a yellowlegs lookalike, and I personally can make a quick judgment and be wrong about this particular species. So this is solitary sandpiper. Solitary sandpiper, you will sometimes see multiple birds, so the name's a little confusing, but they don't flock. So that's a good indicator. Like things like spotted sandpipers, you can see 6 or 8 spotted sandpipers along a shoreline, but they're not in a flock like sandpiper, like least or western sandpipers will get in a tight flock together. So solitaries, you may have more than one individual at a site, but they don't end up flocking together. What makes them very similar to yellowlegs is they have long legs, but they're proportionally not as long-legged as a lesser yellowlegs. The legs are yellow, which is confusing, but they're not boldly yellow. In fact, they're kind of quite dull yellow, sometimes even almost a greenish yellow, but dull yellow legs. Their bill is typically two-toned. The basal portion is light. The distal portion, the outer part, the tip is dark. On yellowlegs, the lesser and the greater, they, for the most part, show a solid dark bill. They can show a little light to the base, but not as reliably as a solitary does. Solitary show a fairly conspicuous eye ring. If we go back a slide here, you can see eye rings in both the greater and the lesser, but they're not nearly as bold as the eye ring is on a solitary. It's long-legged, but not nearly as long-legged as these yellowlegs in proportion on their body. So not quite as long-legged, quite dark back. The speckling on this back, they typically are darker, browner looking, colder, darker looking. And most sandpipers, even though this bird is called a solitary sandpiper, it is a tringa. It's related to yellowlegs. Most of the true sandpipers will show a wing stripe where either the basal portion of the flight feathers or the tips of the coverts are light, so you have a white band through the wing. Solitaries have a consistent dark wing, but they do have boldly banded tails. And sometimes you can see that even on a folded wing on a bird that's standing still, you can sort of see those dark tail bands coming through. more so than what a lesser yellowlegs would show. This species also will do some bobbing, but not nearly as dramatic as the spotted sandpiper. They'll do a little bit of a tail flick up and down, not the big gyrating movement of the spotted sandpiper. So that's a solitary. You often find them in little farm ponds and such.
And we have a question real quick,
Sure.
Eric, if I could interrupt, from Patty. She says, when you see a flock of little peeps flying synchronously, are those least sandpipers?
They could be any of the small sandpipers. So no, it's not a small flock of shorebirds is not indicative of least in particular. We certainly could have flocks of western, some semi-palmated, others as well. So least are one of the most common shorebirds we have here in Colorado as a migrant. It's certainly a possibility. If I'm seeing shorebirds in flight, more than looking at them, what I'm doing is I'm listening. And so if you've got a flock of shorebirds coming at you and they're all, screaming they're hungry because they're all saying eat, 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 then yes, they're least. But just because it's a flock of small sandpipers does not make it least for sure.
Thank you.
Certainly. Okay. All right. Now we're on to a tricky species because it kind of falls halfway in between. The stilt sandpiper is another yellowlegs type bird, looking bird. So they can easily be confused with yellowlegs, but they have this sewing machine foraging behavior where they probe up and down. And so they can often be confused with dowitchers as well. And so what's yellowlegs-esque about them is small head, skinny neck, but more so than either of the yellowlegs will show, the stilt sandpiper shows a nice light supercilium. Their bill length is about closer to lesser yellowlegs than it is to greater, but it's kind of halfway in between. If I visualize this bill length and then compare it to the head width, the bill's a little bit longer, but probably not time. So it's sort of a halfway in between bill length, but the key is it shows a droop or a D curve, whereas the lesser yellowlegs is a straight bill and the greater yellowlegs is either straight or slightly recurved. So a drooping bill and a light supercilium, and then a probing behavior like a dowitcher. And you can see the leg color here on the stilt sandpiper. And most of these slides I've chosen to show are birds either in fall migration or wintering, so that what's typical of what you're going to see as you go out birding here the next month or two. But again, in this photo on the right here, you're seeing the light supercilium, even if you can't see the bill, and you're seeing the probing behavior. And keep this in mind when we get the dowitchers next. The stilt sandpiper, because it is long-legged like a yellowlegs, they really have to bend over. So their profile is really quite cocked downward compared to a dowitcher, which is not as long-legged. And so it's a little bit flatter in its sewing machine probing behavior. Two more images just showing you the dull yellowlegs, which is why you might think these are yellowlegs. But unlike the yellowlegs, the stilt sandpiper shows a drooping bill, mostly towards this last third, the distal third of the bill, and then that light supercilium. So those are two more indications here. We've got a stilt sandpiper. All right, the thought of identifying dowitchers often fills bird watchers with dread, and there is no shame whatsoever in simply saying dowitcher spa. In fact, I'd like to see people put dowitcher spa into their checklists more often, particularly in areas where you have a lot of overlap. Here in Colorado, we have predominantly long-billed, so it's not quite as dramatic, but there are places on the East Coast where you're just as likely to have either species, and so it really oftentimes, especially if they get into non-breeding plumage, you probably the safest bet is simply to call them dowitcher spa. But there are lots of little hints that help to separate them. So I'll go through them. And again, this is one of those where you have to take the accumulation of field marks to determine what you're dealing with. And again, the most reliable thing, if you're seeing a Dowitcher, the first thing I'm doing is digging out my recording equipment, because they often may not call a whole lot. But for Dowitchers, you really want to listen to them, because no matter what age or what plumage state they're in, if it's a juvenile or adult molting, if they're calling, they are distinctive. So I'm going to play short-billed Dowitcher first, which to me reminds me of a greater Yellowlegs. It's a fairly robust toot 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 call note. And everyone learns and remembers vocalizations differently. So if you can come up with some mnemonic device to help you remember and separate these call notes. For me, I don't know why, but it takes me back to my childhood watching Star Trek on syndication. And I think of them as shooting a little stun gun, like some, sci-fi TV show or movie with stun guns. This is what this sounds like to me. Okay, now that compared to the long-billed Dowitcher call is, to me, is much squeakier sounding, more popping. So really fast, very squeaky, very popping sound. So if you're looking at Dowitcher, be sure to be listening as well. There's just one subspecies. It's a monotypic bird, the long-billed Dowitcher. In breeding plumage, they're typically brick red all the way through the belly and the vent. There are 3 subspecies of short-billed Dowitcher. And there's one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in the Central Flyway, which breeds in northernmost central Canada. And so the Hendersoni is the most likely short-billed if we were to get some short-bills coming through Colorado. But in general, you're thinking long-billed for, the expression, if you hear hoof beats, think horses, not zebras. So you're looking for the teasing out short-bills, but for the most part, we're likely to be having long-bills come through. So as I mentioned that slide earlier, and I'll show it here again, they have, if you've got a really super long-billed bird, hey, that's a long bill in that Dowitcher, probably a female Dowitcher, and that sort of gets you leaning. But a male, which is probably what this bird is here. This is the same individual. Had it here in Telluride in April a couple of years ago. There's still snow on the ground. But a very long bill, a very plump-bodied shorebird. Compared to short-billed Dowitcher, you'll see they're quite thick-necked and a little blockier headed. These are all subtleties. In breeding plumage, on the sides of the breast, it's more typically bars on a long billed. On a short billed, it's more on the sides of the breast. In fresh breeding plumage, it's more spotting versus bars. They both have long bills, females longer than males. Some long-billed Dowitchers will show a sort of slight D curve, and it's a gentle D curve sort of happening in the middle of the bill. On short-billed Dowitchers, it's a straight bill, but some of them show a little droop as well. But that droop is more of like a kink right down here at near the tip of the bill. Not none of these things you can completely lean on, but they're more indications, or you take the preponderance of all these field marks together. Other things to consider. On breeding plumage, you've got these covers with these nice white edges. On short bill, I'll show an image later in a moment here. Typically not as much white, more orange fringed versus the cleaner, crisper, whiter fringe. But both heavy-bodied, but thicker necked and headed. They do a sewing machine foraging behavior where they're probing up and down. This head is going up and down, long bills probing in. Body-wise, this sometimes, I think some people may lean on this field mark too much, but in general, you'll hear the expression swallowed a grapefruit. Long-billed Dowitchers tend to have more of a hunched back appearance. Short-billed Dowitchers will often show a more flat-backed appearance. That is not, it's not definitive, but it's, again, a good, get you leaning one way. So if I'm seeing a hunchbacked Dowitcher, that's got me leaning with a thick neck and a heavy head, nice eye arcs here, white fringing, and the brick reddish coming all the way through the belly, I'm thinking long billed. Can't emphasize enough though the vocalization. You really should be listening to them. Record if you can. So this is a field mark that helps if you got them in flight, and this is one of those that's pretty much a clincher. If you look at the underwing here on the left, you've got the flight feathers of primaries and secondaries, the coverts, and then all the way up here, these lesser coverts on long-billed Dowitchers. There's sort of a pale spot where the wing meets the body. And this angle is kind of hard, but you can see even on these long bills here in flight, the wing lining here right up against the body there, there's sort of a pale patch. All this fine vermiculation, this little barring and these greater coverts gives way to a sort of a paler patch. On a short-billed Dowitcher, this is pretty consistent. The underwing is consistent all the way through this area here. So that's, if I'm seeing Dowitchers in flight, I'm looking for this little patch right here. So I'm listening for them. I'm looking for this patch right here at the basal portion of the wing, the lesser coverts, right near the leading edge of the wing. All right, and so Dowitchers in flight will show barring on the tail and then a white up through the back, through the vent. Sorry, the vent, but there's like a V cut, if you will. Another field mark to separate Dowitchers is the barring on the tail. Both short-billed and long-billed have barred black and white tails. But as this flock of juvenile long-billed Dowitchers shows, the tail, the black bands separated by white bands, the black bands are conspicuously thicker than the white bands. The white bands are very thin, the black bands are thicker, overall giving a darker tailed appearance. Short-billed Dowitchers in flight, if you can see the tail, that dorsal view of the tail, the top side of the tail, the white bands are more equal in width to the black bands, giving it overall a whiter appearance than the darker tailed long-billed. But it's a subtlety, it's challenging. Don't hang your hat on it, but it's just one more piece of the puzzle that helps pull it together. All right, short bills now in breeding plumage. So this is a photo by Jesse Fagan, another fellow field guide tour leader. These are some breeding birds in spring, and you've got these where they have a lot more white in the chest and the belly, are breeding plumage long bills that come through the central flyaway, typically are brick red throughout. It's not as much barred on the sides of the breast, more spotting or speckling through here. Again, it's not a, for sure, you know, you can't hang your hat on that, but it's one more clue. The fringing on all of these coverts, so here's some retained ones, so that you can tell these are adults by the retained previous generation, but this oranging, not as much white fringing to the coverts. And then that kinked bill look. These individuals, I think, kind of show it, where the bill looks pretty consistent for 2/3 or 3/4, and then there's a little bit of a crook in the bill right near the tip. This individual as well, a quite blunt tipped bill. And they're not outrageously long. They're long-billed, but they're not super long. And instead of being a gentle curve, it's kind of a kink towards the end. Spotting versus barring, but these are all soft features, if you will. So it's really tricky, best to hear them, of course. What we see a lot of in fall migration are juveniles, and this is actually where Dowitchers can get fairly reliably separated. I'm looking at these Dowitchers, I'm thinking, man, those are long looking bills. So probably some females here. Of course, it's not definitive. I don't know that for certain. But if I'm seeing really long looking bills, that's got me leaning towards long billed. These are cold, fairly dark juvenile birds. They show some rust through the scapulars, but then quite dark through here. But here's the clincher. Check out the tertials on all these birds. They are essentially unmarked in the central part of the tertials on these juvenile long-billed Dowitchers. If we go on to the next one here, this is another photo from Steve Mlodinow shared with me. This is a photo I shared earlier, but going back to it now, this is a juvenile short-billed Dowitcher. And check out these tertials. Look at all this nice rusty orangey marbling through the tertials on this bird. That is a reliable characteristic when you have a juvenile bird. So going back to the longbills, unmarked tertials, other than right at the edges, but nothing internal, compared to the internal of the short-billed. So if you're getting some juvenile Dowitchers, try and hear them. Try and look at that underwing, at those lesser coverts in the underwing, and then look at those tertials. So that long bills there. And in general, this is another subtlety that takes a lot of practice to look at, but long bills tend to be a little bit longer legged, a little longer tarsi, and tibia rather. So the tarsi are below, this is the tibia here. They stand a little taller, so they often are a little bit more erect when they're standing, compared to short-billed, which tend to be a little bit more horizontal as they stand. And it's more noticeable too when they're at rest, when they're sleeping and their heads and their bill are lying on their back. Long-billed tend to be a little bit more with that heavier body, tend to be a little more leaning that way. All right, so that I worked our way through all of the species, the 20 species that I thought we should really be trying to separate here that we see consistently in Colorado. And so this is going to be kind of a quiz phase here. So go ahead. I'm not going to say anything about this bird just yet, but go ahead. But look at the structure of the bird. Check out the habitat it's in. Check out the proportions of the bird. Look at that bill. And before I say anything else, I'll give you a moment here to kind of come up. What do you think this bird is? And I'll tell you what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a fairly long-legged wader, shorebird, but it's not an outrageously long legs, and they're dark. It appears in this light, though it's hard to say with certainty. But what I'm seeing is a fairly plump body, and then look at that big round head. So round body, round head. I'm thinking big ball, small ball, and a big ball. I'm leaning towards a plover. Also, the bill is not very long, and it's a stout. It's a heavy bill, and then overall quite grayish. This is a non-breeding black-bellied plover. So on the shore, heavy stout bill, round head, round body. So black-bellied plover. All right. I'll do like, I think I've got 4 or 5 quiz photos. I can't remember how many I have. So what are you seeing? Check out the habitat it's in. Check out the leg length in proportion to the body. Check out the wing length in proportion to the body. Check out the bill structure, its shape. Is it straight? Is it recurved? Is it decurved? Is it thin? Is it thick? How long is the bill in relation to the width of the head? Does it have an eye ring? Does it not? So I'm seeing here a bird that has light colored legs, but they're not boldly yellow. In fact, I would almost call these greenish, more green than yellow. So kind of a dull greenish yellow leg, but pretty long legs. Not outrageously long like a stilt, but pretty long legs. And they're light colored. So that's got me leaning towards Tringa, the genus Tringa. Overall, pretty dark with nice speckling on the back, conspicuous eye ring. A bill, it's about as long as the head is wide, though it's kind of looking away, so tough to evaluate, but the basal portion is light, the outer portion, the distal portion is dark. This is in some type of almost like a wooded wetland, like a swamp or forested landscape with some water. And that's a good clue as well. It's not part of a flock. This is a solitary sandpiper. Solitary sandpipers are Tringas. They've got these light colored legs, but they're not as bright yellow as the Yellowlegs. The eye ring, the two-tone bill, and the thin bill. These are all good indications here. Okay, doubling up on you. Another quiz. All right. So we're seeing plump-bodied birds with fairly short bills and fairly short legs. So that takes me pretty quickly to peeps, to the small sandpipers. All right, looking at the bills, I'm seeing both of them have a somewhat drooping bill that is fairly thick at the base and tapers to more of a point. Neither one of them have a completely straight bill. They're both drooped a little bit. One of the bills is all dark. One of them has some pale coloration at the basal portion of the mandible. And I'm looking at legs, and I'm seeing yellowish legs here, and I'm seeing dark legs over here. Size is the great deceiver. When you have birds you can compare them to, but this bird certainly looks bigger, but it's also in the foreground. So they're similar sized birds, but this might be a bigger looking bird. Overall, this is quite warm or brownish. So if I'm seeing a small sandpiper with a small bill, drooping light colored legs, warm brown cast, this is a least sandpiper. So if this is a least, and I go over this dark legged bird, that still leaves 4, doesn't eliminate much. Least or light colored legs, warm brown, tapered drooping bill. Of the drooping billed birds, this is a really good mark right here. This basal portion is lighter, kind of an orangey brown. That's a good indication. It also has a fairly conspicuous supercilium, I'm noticing. Then I'm looking at the tertials, and then I'm seeing, well, look at all this primary extension beyond the tertials, and a lot of bird behind. This is a long-winged bird. So if I'm seeing a long-winged peep, that gets me to Baird's or white-rumped. And the fact that it has a conspicuous supercilium, the bill is drooping, and it's got a lighter portion to the mandible, this is a white-rumped sandpiper. Okay, a lone peep. We don't have anything to compare it to, but we know it's a peep, a small sandpiper, because the bill's not terribly long in proportion to the head. The legs aren't particularly long. We know it's not a least. I can clearly see these are dark legs. Though it does have a fairly long bill, and it appears to decurve a little bit. The tertials almost reach the primary tip. So to me, this does not look like a long-winged bird. So I can go ahead and take white-rumped and Baird's out of the running because it's not long-winged enough. The primaries beyond the tertials is not significant. I'm seeing a lot of bird in front of, so if I've eliminated least with dark legs, I've eliminated white-rumped and Baird, so that leaves me western and semi-palmated. So I'm looking at bill. Semi-palmateds have shorter bills, stouter bills, more of a blunt tip. Westerns have a longer bill, more of a droop tip. And then structure, semi-palmated, I think of quite balanced over its legs. This is clearly a heavy-headed bird, chesty, kind of forward-leaning. This is a breeding plumage Western sandpiper. I'm sure all of you got that right. Okay. I see. I think I have one more maybe after this, two more after this. All right, what do we have here? What are we looking at? Bird out on mud flats, but it's in the water, not on the mud. We can't see the feet, which means the legs keep going below the surface, but yet there's still quite a bit of legs. The legs look long. They're light. In fact, they're quite yellow. The bill is quite long, thin, and straight. And it's tipped over as if it's going to probe. And so the leg color and the body structure gets me leaning to a tringa type bird. So maybe a lesser Yellowlegs or a greater Yellowlegs, or maybe like a solitary, or even a stilt sandpiper, because a stilt sandpiper does some probing. But I'm going to say it's not a stilt because the supercilium does not look conspicuous to me. And the bill has no droop to it. That's a straight bill. These legs are not that greenish. They're quite gold, almost, orangey golden yellow. So I don't like it for solitary sandpiper. And a greater Yellowlegs would have a longer bill. So I'm liking this as a lesser Yellowlegs. All right, it's gonna double up on you here now. We've got two shorebirds. Clearly size is an indicator here, one bigger than the other. The bird on the right What are you seeing? Start with the bill because you can see it. That's a short bill. It's kind of hard to get a sense of the shape, but you can certainly see that the bill is shorter than the head is wide. It's not terribly long-legged, though it is light-colored legs. It's clearly smaller than this other shorebird. So the light-colored legs, and overall a brownish, warmish cast to it with a short bill. This is a least sandpiper. So if this is a least, and we jump to the bigger bird, all this rust here with the black patch in the belly, it's pretty clearly a breeding plumage Dunlin. All right, two peeps, two sandpipers at the edge of the water. What are you seeing? Check out the structure. Both of them have fairly short bills, so we're not dealing with Yellowlegs or Dowitchers or anything like that. Not particularly long-legged, so we're dealing with sandpiper types. Over here, I'm seeing a really bulbous, heavy-bodied shorebird. Sandpiper. Over here, I'm seeing a really elongated sandpiper. Look how much primer is beyond the tertials. All right, so let's take a look at this a little farther here. Side of the breast, quite heavily marked, really heavy-bodied, kind of an orangey, rusty coloration. The bill is drooping. The whole basal portion is lighter. This is a pectoral sandpiper. And this beautifully scalloped, pale-fringed bird, a dark bill, really straight bill, a kind of a warm, sandy appearance to it with this nice frosty scaps and coverts, and then that long primary projection and dark legs. This is a Baird's sandpiper. All right, I'm going to end on a real tough one. Here is a bird. Can you find the bird? It's right here in the middle. Okay. So given the image quality and the size of the bird in the landscape, this bird's pretty far away. If it's pretty far away, and I'm seeing a heavy-bodied bird, I'm looking at behavior, and its head is down. I can't see the bill, so I can't use the bill to indicate anything, but I can use its posture to tell me this is the distance based on the landscape size. It's a bird of significant size, heavy-bodied, thick-necked, heavy-headed, and hunchbacked. It's got the swallowed grapefruit look. This is a long-billed Dowitcher. So I don't know how many of you got that, but if you did, kudos to you. And I'd say with that, wraps up my slideshow. So I'm going to go back to the opening slide here and then open it up to any questions anyone might have.
Right now, we don't have any questions in the chat. We just have accolades, how talented and amazing you are.
Oh. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope this didn't overwhelm you. I hope actually, in fact, it inspired you to get out there. This is a prime time. The next 6 weeks or 2 months, we have a lot of fun stuff coming through. So hopefully, I think this was recorded. And so CFO has been great about getting these up to reference to come back to, so you can always revisit if you need to.
Hey, Eric, I'll ask you a question.
Go ahead.
So this is Nick, and my question is, here in Colorado, we have a lot of hybrid gulls, a lot of hybrid ducks, got hybrid buntings and hybrid grosbeaks, hybrid orioles. Should we expect to see hybrid shorebirds out there when we go out on the field trips this month?
Great question. It's certainly a possibility. I don't see my experience with shorebirds. I certainly know of some species that have documented hybrids out there, but it happens a lot less. And I think that's probably an indication more of just how habitat site selection for breeding sites. Some of those other species where we see that readily or hybridize more than others often have overlapping habitat types. So the birds can end up hybridizing, whereas shorebirds are they all have pretty strong niche for nesting requirements and such. So I don't see it happening nearly as much as in shorebirds. But if I see a bird that really doesn't kind of sit right with my head, by all means, hybrids creeps in, but I don't see it nearly as much in shorebirds as I do some other groups of birds.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great
There is a
presentation also.
question from Peggy. Could you just revisit the Bairds and white rump sandpipers? There was just some questions about
Sure.
your photo and taking a look at that. I'm not sure how many slides back that is.
Yeah, let me see if I can get out of this here and scroll down to that one. Let's see. Past the plovers. There we go. So I'll go back up. So yeah, so here it is again. These two. So what's ties them together, if you will, they're in the same genus, of course, but what's similar between them is their structure. They're both long-winged. And in this particular slide, the Bairds look a little bit more elongated than the white rumps, but again, don't get fooled by posture. These birds are actively foraging, and so their necks are extended. If you drop this head back towards the body, like this bird that's at rest, it would look similar. Whereas if this bird, this white rump on the left, extended its head, it would have a very similar body structure. So long-winged, they both are uniformly long-winged. What separates them, the bill, straighter, all dark on the Bairds, on the white rumps, more of a drooping structure, more tapered, and that mandible with that light basal portion, if you can see it. There is a supercilium on Bairds, but it's subtle. It does not pop from the auriculars and the cap. Whereas white rumps, this is a nice breeding plumage bird, but even in the winter plumage or juvenile, the supercilium stands out more in the white rumps, the bill structure difference. And then as they get into winter and plumage, they're more gray. We typically see Bairds coming through in migration as juveniles, and they have this lovely scalloped appearance on an otherwise kind of warm brownish body. So I hope that addresses, or is there a particular question with
No,
that?
I think you covered that. That's wonderful.
Okay.
I
Thank
think the
you.
confusion is that when you look at the title, Bairds comes first, so people were getting confused on which one was on the left and which one was on the right.
Yep, shame on me. That's a good one to modify. I'll have to adjust that if I ever give this again, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, white rump is on the left and Bairds is on the right, which is counterintuitive to how I titled it. So my apologies for that.
There is another question. Is pectoral sandpiper larger than white rumped and Bairds?
It is a bigger bird. It's also just heavier bodied structure. In fact, I have a slide of that. It was one of the quizzes. Let me skip ahead to that.
While you're skipping ahead to that, a reminder to everybody, if you go to cobirds.org, you can sign up for Shorebird focused field trips the last weekend in August and the first 2 weekends in September. And we're going to be hitting just about every main shorebird hotspot in the state. So we'd love to see you sign up for some of those field trips. Thanks, Eric.
Sure. Yeah, actually, that's great. Best way to learn is to get out there in the field. So here's pectoral sandpiper, really robust, plump-bodied shorebird versus the Bairds. This one's obviously reaching, so it accentuates that elongated profile. But tertials coming towards the tip, whereas this got a lot of primary beyond the tertials. So more elongated, thinner bodied, heavy bodied, chunkier on the pec. Slightly, and you can just see these are pretty close together. This is a slightly bigger bird. The size does help when they're near each other, but not when they're alone.
Well, great. I think you've answered all the questions that we've had. We can't thank you enough for a fantastic Zoom tonight. We learned a ton, and we can't wait to get out in the field. You're doing 2 workshops
Yes.
in the northeast corner of the state. So hopefully we'll get those filled up tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in the field. Eric, a
Excellent.
great job as usual. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. Stay safe out there, everyone. Have fun.
All right. Good night, everybody.